This week on Q&A, author Simon Sebag Montefiore. He discusses his book, The Romanovs, about the dynasty that ruled Russia for over 300 years.
Simon Sebag Montefiore, the book is called The Romanovs, 1613 to 1918. And I want to read you a headline in the Daily Mail, London Daily Mail. You wrote this back in January. The red-hot Romanov romance, scandal of the married czar and his 16-year-old mistress, revealed in the raunchiest love letters ever written by a head of state.
I have to say, I didn't actually write that.
Right.
That's the headline written by the Daily Mail headline writer. But I would say that the correspondence they're referring to is the most outrageous and most explicit correspondence ever written by a head of state. And I have to say, the correspondence is so outrageous that the editor of the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday in England, rang me up and said, you know, we're a tabloid newspaper in England, but we can't print all this stuff. We're a family newspaper.
Who was it? Who was the head of state?
Well, the head of state was Tsar Emperor Alexander II, the emperor who liberated the serfs, the slaves of Russia, at exactly the same time, 1861, as your President Lincoln was about to liberate the slaves of America. And the two men were actually in correspondence, and both of them were assassinated. So, interesting relationship that, for a start. And Alexander II was really the most sympathetic of all the Romanovs in this book, I think. And he also brought in jury trials and local elected assemblies, and so he sort of laid some of the foundations for reform. He wanted to bring in a constitution, which was really the last proper chance to bring it in, but he was assassinated the day he was going to bring in that constitution. But as for the love life, that's another thing altogether.
Well, let me ask you first, where did you find the love letters?
Well, the love letters are in the Russian archives in Moscow. But there's an interesting story there, because these love letters have never really been worked on by any historians before, and that's because they've only recently returned to the Russian archives. And this is how it happened. When Alexander II was assassinated, his widow, his mistress, who'd become his wife, Princess Katya, left Russia and went to live in Paris, and she took most of this huge correspondence, 3,000 outrageous letters, with her to Paris, where they remained in private hands until 1998. And in 1998, the Rothschild banking family bought these letters. Why? Because in 1945, the Red Army had captured, when they took Berlin and Vienna, had captured the Rothschild banking archives, and they took them back to Moscow. And they wanted to swap, and the Russians agreed. So the Rothschilds got their banking archives, which aren't very interesting, I'm sure, but Moscow got these letters, and at last we could work on them all. And they're love letters between a 40-something-year-old emperor, Alexander II, and his young schoolgirl, 18-year-old mistress when they met, and they started their affair. They're passionate, they're poignant, they're increasingly political, and they're highly uninhibited and sexual. And in fact, there's stuff in these letters that I didn't even know was invented in the 1870s. I thought it had only just been invented in the 21st century. But you'll have to read them to see what I'm referring to.
So this article that you wrote doesn't have all the racy stuff in it?
It doesn't have all the racy stuff in it, because some of it is very racy, even by the standards of 2016.
How long was Alexander II the emperor?
Well, he was emperor from 1855 to 1881.
And how was he assassinated?
Well, it was a tragedy. He'd brought in reform. He believed in reform. He'd negotiated this complex emancipation of the serfs. So he'd shown real political skill. But he raised expectations in the 1860s for reform of autocracy, which he was not willing to fulfill. This caused a backlash that led to a terrorist movement demanding the destruction of autocracy altogether. And these terrorists hunted him like a wild animal. They threw bombs at him, they fired guns at him. In fact, he believed, because his mistress, Katya, was there on the day of the first assassination attempt, he believed she was his guardian angel. And there were 6 attempts to kill him, but she couldn't save him. When it came to 1881, after they'd been together for all these years, the bomb was thrown at his carriage. He was fine. The carriage was smashed, but he got out and he inspected the dead and wounded. And his guard said, "Please get back in the carriage. Please, let's get you out of here." He said, "No, I want to inspect, this wounded man. That's what I do. I'm an emperor." And there was one more terrorist, one more killer, and they just threw the bomb right at his feet and blew his legs to smithereens. He was taken back to the Winter Palace, where he died on his couch. And one of the people who saw him die was a little boy who became Nicholas II, his grandson.
Reading your book, and I just kept asking, how does this man remember all this? I mean, I probably could get in here and find somewhere a statistic you wouldn't remember, but
you certainly would. You could find a lot I don't remember.
What technique do you use in order to put all this together? And I want you to eventually get into how many Romanovs there were and all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, writing these books is a huge challenge and is a nightmare. And for some reason, I have a taste for doing these vast subjects like Jerusalem over 5,000 years. This is only about 400 years, but it's 20 or 21 Romanov princes or czars and tsarinas, empresses and emperors, and it covers so many years. So you can imagine every single monarch in this book has their children, their wives, their mistresses, their ministers, their field marshals, their great poets and composers, and all of this has to be mastered. So writing these books is a hell of a mental challenge, I have to say, and I literally immerse myself in the subject for the few years that I'm doing it. I only read about this subject, and obviously afterwards I can't wait to read some sort of James Ellroy thrillers or something. The day I finish, I start reading sort of John le Carré or James Ellroy or something like that. But during it, I concentrate absolutely on it, and I just work my way from the beginning, reign by reign. And with each one, I read all the books on the subject, first of all. I get all the books and journals, articles that have been published in Russia. And then ultimately, I go to Russia and walk around the palaces, look at the archives, and then when I feel I've got enough, I move on to the next monarch.
You were here last in 2004, and we also did an interview, Peter Slin did, in London in 2013. I want to just put up on the screen the number of nonfiction books you've written so that the audience can know the kind of thing you've been involved in. We go back to the first one in 2001, Catherine the Great and Potemkin.
Yes.
Stalin, the Court of the Tsar, which we talked about in 2003.
We did.
Young Stalin, 2007. Jerusalem, the biography in 2011. And we say the Romanovs, you say Romanovs.
Well, I mean,
doesn't matter, but it.
Yeah. I say both actually. I mean, the Russians say Romanov, but we English say Romanov, and we say Potemkin, but they say Pochomkin. Doesn't matter.
I want to. You mentioned Rothschild, the name Rothschild. I want to quote back to you. This is a 2008 Vanity Fair article that undoubtedly you remember, in which a friend of yours, the Honorable Hannah Rothschild. Who is she?
She's a novelist and writer, and she's head of the British Museum, or she's a very important woman in England, and she's the daughter of Lord Rothschild, and she's a great person.
Here's the quote, though.
Yeah.
He is the best lunch date in London. His gossip is so clever, ranging through centuries and across all sections of society. Did you find that to be a compliment?
I don't know. What do you think? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that is a compliment, but she's a great person, so she can get away with saying this stuff.
Are you a gossip?
Well, I think all human affairs, all human business, all politics is about human relationships. You can call that gossip if you like. I'm not terribly interested in gossip that has no importance on the world stage, but if you look at these books, for example, in all of them, they are studies of power and how power works, its effect on personality, and the effect of personalities on power. I think the interesting thing is that even if whether you're talking about an imperial court with flunkies and chamberlains and ladies in waiting, or whether you're talking about the office of the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of England, elected officials, power works in a similar way, and it emanates from the person who's been elected, who has the power, whether it's Obama or Putin. And I'm a student of the way that works, and I'm fascinated by the way that happens. So I'm hoping that this book, I mean, you can read it as an entertainment about a lot of shocking murders and the rest. You can look at it as an explanation about how Russia works today, or you can just look upon it as a study of human nature and power. And you can call that gossip. But really, it repeatedly shows, I've just given you one example, in 1881, when Alexander II was murdered, his personality was essential to reform going ahead. When he was assassinated, reform really ended in Russia until 1917. So personality, again and again and again in Russian history, just as in American history, look at Putin, look at Trump, look at the Clintons. Again and again, personality is decisive in power and in politics. And so my books concentrate on the personal.
Who was your favorite personality, not your favorite leader, but the one that you had the most fun researching?
Well, Peter the Great is just totally compelling. And, he's a misunderstood character. And I wanted to look at him in a very political sense, as well as a colourful character.
When was he the emperor? Well,
he was emperor until 1725, he died. And he'd been the emperor since 1682, since he was a child. So, an incredibly long reign. I tell you what I find kind of breathtaking with these people. You look at some of the two of the greatest men in this book, Peter the Great and Prince Potemkin, who was Catherine the Great's partner, minister, probably her secret husband. They are two of the most talented individuals in the whole Romanov story, and yet both of them died at 52. Now I'm 50, so that's a pretty terrifying statistic. Now there's a statistic that I remember, and that is on my mind at the moment, because think of all they achieved in their years, and they died at 52, both of them utterly exhausted, by the way.
What did they achieve? Let's start with Peter the Great, and why was he called the Great?
Well, he was called the Great because he achieved so much. He modernized Russia. He brought in modern military, modern artillery, modern technology, Western experts, Western forms of government, and he modernized the military to the extent that they could defeat the greatest military power in Europe of their day, Sweden. He founded St. Petersburg, a new northern capital, a modern city, a Venice of the North. He conquered the Baltic, and he created the Baltic Fleet, which made Russia a naval power for the first time. And he did all of this really through the force of his personality. And despite all the rational reasons and the wonderful Swedish methods of government and the German titles he brought in at court and the modern artillery that he developed for the military and these wonderful ships of the line for his Russian Navy, despite all of this modern stuff, he was always basically an autocrat who ruled wherever he was the government. Whatever he said was the government. If he slept, the government slept. When he was drunk, the government was drunk. He was everything. And he was the ultimate personal ruler of Russia. He was a genius, but he was also a monster. He took part in the beheadings of his enemies. He tortured his own son to death. He was fascinated with the human body, dismantling it. I remember when he was in Holland and he attended all these dissections, these medical dissections. He was fascinated with the human body. Afterwards, he queued up and he said, "Can I bite the body? I want to see how the dead body feels in your teeth." And then he made his entire entourage do the same. And after that, he bought his own collection of surgical tools. And some of his entourage had a sore tooth. He insisted on pulling it out himself. Another one had a bad foot. Off went the foot. So after that, if you had a sore arm or a bad tooth or a sore ear, and you were in Peter the Great's entourage, you made sure you never mentioned it.
How many different, you said 21 or something like that, but how many different emperors did you write about?
I think there are 20. There are 20 that actually ruled, but there are also many regents, many prime ministers, many field marshals. There are many characters. There are many artists. I mean, this book has everyone from Tchaikovsky and Pushkin to Dostoevsky, and it has many fascinating and talented people, from Potemkin, who was probably the most talented minister that the Romanovs ever had, to Rasputin, who was probably one of the least talented, at least politically, least talented advisors the Romanovs ever had.
Can we talk about Rasputin for a minute?
Sure.
You go into great detail about him. When did he first pop up in the Russian society?
Well, he first popped up in 1905, and it's interesting. Well, I think the sort of analysis of him in the past has been slightly skewed for different ways. Too much emphasis on whether he's a healer or not, the haemophilia of Tsarevich Alexei. And what's much more important, I think, is that he represented what Nicholas Alexander felt was the authentic foundation of the Romanov autocracy, which was the relationship between the Tsar and the peasantry.
Do you recognize who he's sitting with? Or he's sitting and who's standing behind him?
No, I don't recognize them, but there he is, unmistakable, Rasputin.
Who was the first emperor he had contact with?
Well, Nicholas II.
Only Nicholas II.
Nicholas
So it
II.
started with Nicholas. And what was his relationship with Nicholas II's wife?
Well, there was no love affair. These are great pictures. There's no love affair. There was no love affair, as was rumoured, with Alexandra. But Alexandra and Nicholas both absolutely needed Rasputin. First of all, there was the healing of the haemophiliac child, a tragic story, a tragic family story, and the parents were agonized by the child suffering, by his pain as he almost died repeatedly from haemophiliac attacks, but also by the immense stress they placed on themselves by insisting that he must succeed to the full plenitude of autocracy, and that the disease had to be a total secret. So this placed enormous stress on the child and on themselves.
And what years Nicholas II and Alexander?
Well, this is 1905. 1904 is when the child Alexei was born. They meet Rasputin in 1905, the next year, and he remains absolutely key to them right up until his murder in 1916, in December 1916.
I guess I didn't ask you right. The Nicholas II was the emperor for how long total?
Over 20 years. Over 20 years, 1894 to 1917.
And the reason I wanted to talk about Rasputin, this is the end of the Romanovs.
This is the end. We've started, so we're sort of starting at the end. But it's, it's interesting you ask about Rasputin, because Rasputin became essential to the parents as well as the child. But he didn't really become totally politically important and essential until World War I. And in World War I, in 1915, Nicholas decided to become Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Army. And he left the capital in the charge of the Empress Alexandra. Now, the Empress Alexandra was an extremely prudish woman, extremely self-righteous, religious, who believed absolutely in sacred autocracy as a system, had a complete disdain for democracy. And
can I interrupt to ask you, define the word autocracy?
Autocracy is just the rule of one man. But sacred autocracy, that is the Romanov ideology, that Russia could only be ruled by one man, the Tsar of the legitimate, God-given, God-blessed Romanov dynasty. And when Nicholas II left Alexandra in complete command of politics back in Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was then renamed, she found herself in this preposterous situation, having had for over 20 years complete contempt for all politics and high society and politicians, particularly and journalists. She suddenly found herself in the business of politics, and she knew nobody. So she had to turn, this self-righteous, very prudish woman, had to turn to the one person who she felt might know some people in Petersburg, and that was Rasputin, who only knew the most incompetent, corrupt and depraved people in St. Petersburg. So irony of ironies, the people he sent her and suggested as minister to her were the most depraved and incompetent people in St. Petersburg. And this was a catastrophe. And this book is based on many correspondences between Tsars and private correspondences. The several thousand letters between Nicholas and Alexander at that time, apart from being fascinating because they're very sexually passionate about each other, they're very close, it also reveals how isolated they were. Isolated by their own wishes, by the way, and how much they depended to an absurd degree on Rasputin. And when you read Alexandra's letters, you realize that she was close to being insane. she was unbalanced. I mean, the letters, when you read the book, I think people will be amazed just how unstable she was, and she'd be sending Nicholas things like Rasputin's comb to brush his hair before he met ministers so he'd be blessed and protected, things like this. So you realize that the prestige and the power of the monarchy is seeping away fast when she's in charge.
Who didn't like Rasputin?
Well, no one liked Rasputin except for the imperial family, of which there were the children, the 4 daughters and the son, and the imperial couple. And by the time World War I started in 1914, no one liked Rasputin. But people just couldn't face the fact that the responsibility for the misrule in Russia belonged to the Tsar and Tsarina, but particularly the Tsar. And they blamed it on Rasputin. They were sure that if they killed Rasputin, they would solve the problem of Russia's misrule.
How did they do it? I mean, if you go to St. Petersburg, and a lot of Americans do, where would they find Nicholas and Alexandra living at that time, and where did Rasputin live?
Well, Nicholas and Alexandra lived outside St. Petersburg. They hated St. Petersburg. They regarded it as a cesspit of immoral debauchery. And they lived out at Tsarskoye Selo, which was a suburban palace, and they lived in the Alexander Palace, the palace built by Catherine the Great for her grandson, Alexander I, the Tsar of War and Peace. We might come to him later. But
where's the Winter Palace?
The Winter Palace is right in the center of St. Petersburg. Now, Rasputin lived in a flat in the city, and when he came out to see the Tsar and Tsarina in Tsarskoye Selo, he would meet them in a small cottage outside the city gates that no one knew about, that belonged to a friend of theirs. And that little house is still there, by the way. And no one goes to see it, but they should, because that was where Russia was, in a way, governed. And it's just outside the gates. They'd come out, because all the police and so on, controlled by the Ministry of the Interior, would make a record of anyone visiting. But anyway, this way, they'd avoid anyone knowing. But of course, everybody knew anyway. And meanwhile, also in the city, there's the Yusupov Palace, which I'm sure many American tourists will visit. And that has the room where Rasputin was killed, and the courtyard where he was killed. And Prince Yusupov was the wealthiest man in Russia. He was a cross-dressing, bisexual opium addict, an interesting character who'd been at Oxford University, of course. And him and his friend, Grand Duke Dmitri, was a member of the imperial family. They were both members of the imperial family, in fact. And they decided that the only way to save Russia and save the monarchy was to kill Rasputin. They romanticized the killing of Rasputin in the ways that we all know, so that kind of Rasputin was kind of poisoned, but he got up again. He was shot, but he got up again. You know, virtually like a vampire movie. You know, they virtually claimed they stuck a stake in his heart, and that finally killed him. But in fact, the murder was very different from that, and there were interesting things about it. One is, we now know there was some sort of British involvement. The British Secret Service, the early version of MI6, was involved somehow in plotting against Rasputin, and may have actually been involved in the assassination plot. Well, Rasputin was widely believed, first of all, to be against the war, which was true, and that was about the only sensible policy, or one of the few sensible things he did devise, was stay out of the war. But that was a very difficult thing to do, to stay out of the war. It wasn't something that Nicholas II was really strong enough to withstand the pressure to go into the war.
Which side was Russia on?
Russia was on the Allied side, the American side, the British side, and the French side. So, they decided that the British were interested in him being killed. One, to keep Russia in the war, and two, to save the monarchy. Without the monarchy, Russia would, in any case, probably leave the war. And many people believed that the monarchy would be destroyed if Rasputin continued his dark influence. So somehow, British agents who were friends with Yusupov were involved in this plot. And what really happened was, they lured him to this house, they shot him once, the bullet didn't kill him, he ran outside, and somebody from behind fired at him and brought him down with a second shot that was not fatal. And this is the interesting bit. At this point, someone walked up with a huge pistol, like a sort of Clint Eastwood-style Magnum, and they put it right against Rasputin's forehead here, point blank, and just blew him away like that. You know, so it was not this kind of romantic, sort of gothic story that we see in sort of Hollywood movies. It was more like just the cold-blooded execution of a peasant.
Here's the famous picture of Rasputin on the screen.
Yeah.
What effect did this have on, and what exact year was he killed?
December 16. But you can see there, this is a great picture. This is where he's actually, they've dug that, they found the body underneath the ice in the Neva River.
They threw him in the
They threw him under the ice, and it took a while to find him. And what's interesting is, he's thawing there before his autopsy, but you can see that the point-blank shot to the middle of the forehead is an execution shot, and there you can see it pretty clearly.
So what impact did it have that they killed him?
Well, the funny thing was, it didn't have the impact anyone expected. Instead of strengthening the monarchy, it exposed and emasculated the monarchy, because it revealed that nothing changed when Rasputin died. Nicholas II was still the same Nicholas II ruling with Alexander before. He didn't suddenly start reforming the country or giving into a constitutional government or giving into a representative government. Nothing changed. All it showed was that the government was hollow and that Nicholas II was a deeply incompetent ruler.
I'm at the end for a couple of reasons. One, Nicholas and Alexander's assassination, and the fact that the Bolsheviks took over in 17. I want you to kind of lead us up to that and explain, after this assassination of Rasputin, when did the next step in this process happen?
Well, I mean, that was in December 1916. I mean, the monarchy literally lasted 2 months afterwards. And the irony was that, this wasn't a revolution led by Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky. They were all in exile or in Siberia. In fact, Lenin had said, just weeks before, he said, we've missed it. This revolution's never going to happen in my lifetime. But here it came. It was totally unexpected, and yet easily predictable, because people started to protest about food shortages in the capital, and it's quickly spread. The troops who were in the cities started to fraternize with the rebels, and Nicholas was far away at the front. And he tried to.
Where was he?
Well, he was right at the front at the headquarters, and it took him a long time to get back. And he was foolish to try to get back in a rush, because his train got sidelined, supposedly stopped by workers, and he found himself totally alone in a railway station in the middle of nowhere. And he had to ask his generals what to do, and the generals said, as one, abdicate. And so suddenly he was alone in his imperial carriage, and he had to sign an abdication. So first of all, he abdicated to his son, Alexei, the Tsarevich, the haemophiliac boy, now in his teens. And then he spoke to his doctor, and he said, just tell me something, is this haemophilia curable? The doctor said no. He said, is it, how long could he live? He said, well, he could live a long time, and he could die at 30. He could die very young. And then he sort of said, you know what, I've decided I'm going to change my plan. I'm going to change my abdication. I'm going to leave the throne to my brother Michael, and keep the child with me. Even though,
was that his decision? That
was his decision.
Any emperor could say this is where it's going next.
Well, that's a good question, actually. That's a very interesting question. One of the great themes of this book, and of modern Russian history, and if we look at Putin, is succession. The succession in any government is a measure of its orderliness, of its authority, of its system, if you like. And up until Tsar Paul I in 1796, any Tsar could just appoint anyone who the hell they liked as their successor. So Peter the Great's successor was his wife, Catherine I, one of the more extraordinary, colourful female characters in this book.
Not the Great, she was Catherine I.
Yeah, Catherine I. But she was little better than a sort of camp follower. She'd first appeared walking naked as a prisoner into the Russian camp. She was neither a Russian, nor Orthodox, nor noble, and yet Peter the Great married her and renamed her Catherine and crowned her Empress of Russia. And when he died, she was chosen as his successor, even though she had no claim to the throne. So in Russia, the state can make, the state can break someone. That's the power of autocracy. So up until then, Tsars could choose their own successors, but after 1796, no more. The irony is that in nowadays, since the 1990s and in 2016, the presidents of Russia, who are again autocrats, can choose their own successors again in a way that is unthinkable, really, in the 21st century. So you have President Putin was named by Yeltsin as his successor. The election was sort of fixed. And similarly, Putin chose Medvedev. Medvedev chose Putin again, nominally. So once again, we're in a situation in Russia where, despite all the trappings of democracy and the facade of democracy, again, the Tsar can choose his own successor.
But go back to why, the whole revolution in 1917 and what happened to the last Romanovs. And
yes, well, that's just a terrible story. By the way, I don't take the usual romantic approach to Nicholas and Alexandra that is traditional. The movie view. I don't take it. And I differ from the sort of traditional romantic approach. They were a couple who were in love with each other. They were loving parents, but they were also rulers. And I think when people read in this book what they were really like, I think people will be amazed about how rabidly anti-Semitic they were, for example. The stuff about Jews is pretty shocking, considering that they're regarded as wonderful romantic heroes, Nicholas and Alexandra.
And that connects to you and your family.
Well, it connects to me and my family because we left Russia at that time, my mother's family, to escape them. But also, their kind of Nicholas and Alexandra's kind of vindictiveness, their duplicity. I think people will be surprised when they read the book that that they may not recognize a Nicholas and Alexandra that they thought they knew, and the family is only one part of it. But I will say that when they were overthrown in February 1917, they did conduct themselves with immense grace in facing fear, humiliation, of being prisoners of a Republican government, of a provisional government. And they then behave with immense dignity, and that's why they've been made into saints by the Russian Orthodox Church. But at the same time as it's worth remembering that at the same time as Nicholas II, now abdicated, now deposed, was reading Tolstoy and books to his children in captivity, he was also reading his children the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the rabidly anti-Semitic forgery. So that just gives us a little bit of perspective. But in the end, when the Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, and Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, this was a totally new turn of events. Suddenly they were in danger of their lives. And it was unthinkable that the children could be in danger of their lives too. But Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin were ruthless operatives, and they could take no chances. It's clear when you look at it that the orders to kill them all, including the children, came from the top, came from Lenin. Even though Lenin was far too clever to leave a written order, he was very aware of history. But when it came to kill them, to kill all of them, these four gorgeous young daughters, the innocent son, as well as the parents, as well as the family doctor and the entourage that was left, never has a murder been so bungled. Never has a crime been so, if it was possible to make it more appalling and more atrocious, they did it by sheer incompetence. And of course,
where were they? Set the scene where they were.
They were in a house in Ekaterinburg, the Apatiev house, which had been renamed the House of Special Purpose, a very sinister name for the house. And they were kept there. All the windows were painted white. And the family were sort of kept in total isolation. Different members of their entourage were taken away mysteriously and then shot in the woods. And gradually they realized that something terrible was going to happen. And yet the white armies, the armies opposed to the revolution, were approaching, and they could hear the guns at night. And the order came from Moscow to the Ekaterinburg, to the Urals Soviet, that if the whites got too near, they could wipe out the whole family. And so this job was done. They were woken up at about 1 in the morning. They came downstairs, putting on their clothes. They were taken into one room, a cellar room.
But they just thought they were being moved.
They thought they were being moved. They came down. The little boy sat down. He'd recently had a haemophiliac attack. Empress Alexandra asked for a seat. She sat down. Nicholas stood in front of the boy, seemingly protective. And suddenly, these sort of 12 ruffians came in with guns and bayonets and pistols and rifles. And half of them were drunk. Some of them were psychopaths who'd murdered people before. One of them had beheaded a man during a bank robbery before the revolution. And they came in and they read a sentence of death. and then they all started firing. But it all went wrong immediately because everyone was supposed to kill one person. But of course, a lot of them weren't comfortable shooting girls. So they aimed at the person they were meant to shoot, and then they suddenly switched their gun and shot at Nicholas II in the chest. So he was killed instantly, but everyone else was screaming, and all of them were alive still. And then there was this kind of free-for-all of shooting a fusillade after fusillade, killing some of them. But tragically, all the girls and all the children basically were wearing their own bizarre bulletproof vests. Not bulletproof vests, but vests sewn with the Romanov diamonds. Hundreds and hundreds of diamonds have been sewn into their underwear so they could have money in case they escaped, in case they needed to buy their way out. And they'd spent months sewing these diamonds in. You know, can you imagine? They had billions, the equivalent of billions of pounds on their bodies, and they weighed an enormous amount. But when the bullets came, tragically, these made their execution and their agony much, much longer because the bullets bounced off diamonds, the hardest substance known to man, and they didn't die. So then they had to go in among the bodies, the floor, as they said, like there's so much blood on the floor it was as slippery as an ice rink, and they had to walk in and stab them and shoot them in the head. And still, two of the girls at the end of all this, after end of like half an hour of mayhem, terrible mayhem, two of the girls were still sort of coughing and awake and had to be stabbed and shot all over again. I mean, writing it, I must admit, I sort of wept when I was writing this scene. It's agony. It's agony.
Who reported on what happened? Because as I remember, you talk about being in a room with a dim light bulb and you can't see each other and all that. But who had the information?
Well, the interesting thing is that all the several of the assassins, of the murderers, proudly wrote memoirs about what they'd done, and because the whole thing was such a debacle, and because it took literally 3 days and 3 nights without sleep to actually bury the bodies, because what happened with the bodies afterwards, which I don't think we should go into now, because it involved sulfuric acid and fire and petrol and fire, and being buried in different places, and terrible things being done to the bodies of the girls especially, and Nicholas, that when they came to write their memoirs, they were so confused about what had happened in this kind of sleepless 3-day struggle to sort of dispose of the bodies, that they contradicted themselves in different places. So there are different versions of the story, and all of these were kept in the archives. And these
is this new information that you found?
Not all of it. No, I mean there are new aspects of it. Yeah, but the story is still going on, which is so interesting because, as everyone knows, the bodies were found in the 90s and buried in 1998. Boris Yeltsin presiding, and they were buried in the family vault in the Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg. But two of the bodies were missing. Not Anastasia, who did not survive, but Grand Duchess Maria, her sister, and the Tsarevich Alexei, and their bodies were never found. And then 10 years later, in 2007, so very recently, they found the remains of those two bodies, just bits of skeleton, and they were tested by Western specialists and found to be the Romanovs, the missing Romanovs. But the Orthodox Church, backed as always by the president of the Russian Federation, because in Russia the Orthodox Church is really a branch of the autocracy, challenged these findings, and so for 10 years nothing was done with these body parts. Then last year, we're right up to date now, last year President Putin, his security agencies, and the church suddenly decided they would test everything again. So they've exhumed Nicholas II temporarily, tested his body, they've exhumed the children, and they've tested these two last bodies. And at the time we're speaking, nothing's been announced yet. But I think this has something to do with Putin's view of history, Putin's preparation for the centenary in 1917 and 1918, the centenary which is coming up next year and the year after. So something is up with this. I don't know what it is, but we're right there now. So the Romanovs, in some senses, this story is happening right now as we speak in Russia. Something's about to happen. And it reflects President Putin's view of history. And his view is very interesting. He is without ideology. he regards the two worst Tsars of Russia as Gorbachev and Nicholas II, for example. One is a Soviet leader, one is a Romanov Tsar. He regards Lenin as a disaster for Russia, but he regards Stalin as a hugely successful statesman. He regards Peter the Great, Alexander I, Nicholas I as great, Catherine the Great, and Potemkin as great Russian statesmen. But he regards Nicholas II as a useless flop who betrayed the country by abdicating. And he regards Gorbachev, our great hero, who we regard as such an impressive liberal modernizer, he regards him as a disaster too. So he sees the emperors of Russia apolitically. He judges them by their success, and he sees himself, President Putin, as a Russian leader, a Russian leader of the Russian world, to be judged with the great rulers of Russian history.
Go back to your comment about anti-Semitism and your own family and all that. I think I read in your Lenin and Trotsky, who were on either side of Stalin at one point, were Jewish?
No, Lenin wasn't Jewish.
Not at all. No Jewish.
Some Jewish, something like a 16th Jewish or something. He was basically Russian. He also was part Tatar. Stalin was Georgian, and Trotsky was Jewish.
The reason I ask you that is because throughout your book there's a lot of anti-Semitism over the years. What's the basis of that?
Well, this is the strange thing, is that, you know, the Romanovs let anti-Semitism become a family fetish that made no sense for them whatsoever. And this goes to a sort of wider crisis in the monarchy that they had, which was that, you know, they couldn't quite decide if they wanted to be emperor of this huge multinational, multi-religion empire with all these different religions and faiths, the Finns, the Poles, the Jews, the Georgians, the Armenians, and so on, the Tartars who were Muslim, or if they wanted to be Russian Tsars, nationalistic Tsars of the Slavs. So this is one of the kind of contradictions that they couldn't quite work out. And in the end, from Nicholas I onwards, they basically plumped for being nationalist Russian rulers, and they gradually and incredibly foolishly alienated all of their minorities, none more so than the Poles, the Georgians, and the Jews, which is why so many of those peoples became Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and revolutionaries and terrorists. But they did it completely. It was a completely absurd concept. They regarded the Jews. Nicholas II used to say, the Englishman is a Yid, by which he meant that the English and the Jews were the same. They believed in all the things that were wrong with the modern world, newspapers, the stock exchange, democracy. Everything that Nicholas II hated, and he regularly talked about Jews. Once he said, someone said to him, "What's a newspaper? What do you think happens in a newspaper?" And he said, "A newspaper is just a bunch of Jews trying to make everyone go to war with each other." So he was rabidly anti. There's a great scene when he goes and stays with his cousins in England. He goes and stays with Edward VII at Sandringham, and Edward VII was incredibly pro-Jewish and friends with the Rothschilds and other big Jewish families, and he had one of these big Jewish tycoons staying there, Baron Hirsch, who was the wealthiest man in Europe at the time. And he deliberately had him to sort of try and introduce him to Nicholas II to make him more pro-Jewish. And Nicholas II was horrified, and he wrote to his mother, he said, "They've got a lot of Jewish horse dealers staying here, and I'm so horrified that I think I'm just not going to say a word the whole weekend." So that's what he did.
I want to put the list of your books back up on the screen. Of all those books, which one sold the best?
I think Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, and Jerusalem are the two that have sold the best. I mean, they're now in many, many languages. I think they're in 45 languages now or something.
But from your standpoint, what's the thread through all these books?
Well, the thread is simple. The thread is just, these are books that I longed to write, and I passionately wanted to write. I wanted to produce books on these subjects that were based on scholarship, based on new archives, and yet were readable by everybody, accessible.
So if we saw you in an archive, where would that archive be physically?
Well, it would either be in a kind of former palace in Moscow, or in the archive, the Soviet archives, which is a special building, 1920s building in Moscow, Or I might be walking around a palace, trying to work out which actual rooms they actually lived in. Or if it was Jerusalem, I might be walking around the city, going down the tunnels, trying to understand how different layers of the city were built on top of each other.
The last time you were here in 2004, we were talking about the archives, and you had been in the archives, of course, for the Stalin book. There was some inference at that time that the archives were going to be closed. What's happened from 2004 to now in Russia with archives?
Well, there's been a huge sort of tightening of. There's been a huge tightening of access to the archives. It's much harder to work on them now, especially the modern ones. I mean, they don't care so much about the Romanov archives, to be honest, but the Stalin archives and any political archives, if they're not open, or if they haven't already been shown totally to the public, they're not going to open now, probably. And there's a real dark atmosphere in Russia at the moment, and this is part of an anti-Western, a xenophobic atmosphere. And working in those archives was never easy, believe you me. I remember the first time I started working on Catherine the Great and Potemkin's archives, the archivists were determined that I wouldn't find anything. And when I started working, sitting underneath the gallery in this archive, looking at the documents for the first time, the archivist who tried to stop me went upstairs, and as I leant over the papers, there was a squealing sound, and something landed on my head, and it was a kitten. And I looked up at the archivist, and she just was leaning over there, and she just waved at me like that. She was just letting me know that I wasn't that welcome in the archives.
How many hours, how many days have you spent in those archives over there?
I've spent months over there in those archives, but also walking around places is also hugely important, in writing these books, because so often, like when I was writing about Catherine the Great and Potemkin, Potemkin villages are villages that are fake, that have never been built, and book after book just said he never built anything; it was all a fake. And when I went down to the south, to Crimea, to Ukraine, to Sebastopol, and so on, I found many of these, many of these places had been built by him, and they're still there. But when you were
here before, we talked about you'd been to all 15 homes of Stalin,
yeah.
And have you been to all the homes of all the Romanovs?
Yeah, pretty much.
How many?
Oh, I don't know. There are probably at least 15 palaces, probably more. There are so many of them, because every Grand Duke had their palace. I haven't been to every single one, far from it. There were thousands of them, probably. I mean, if you include all the hunting lodges, not thousands, but probably there are probably up to 100 residences.
Would people let you in?
Yeah, they'd let us in.
Did you have to have a translator with you, or can you now speak good Russian?
My Russian is still a work in progress, but without it, you couldn't do any of this work. And you can get into all these places. And as for the letters themselves, there are many. Some of them are in Russian, but many of them are in English. I mean, one of the things that may surprise people is that everyone hated Empress Alexandra as the German, but actually she was really English. She was brought up by Queen Victoria, and she wrote her letters between Nicholas and Alexandra. The love letters are all in English, a very sort of broken English, but in English.
Time is running out, and
yeah.
This has nothing to do with these books, but it does have something to do with you. I want to show your wife, who has written how many novels by now?
Oh, at least 15.
And you two live in Kensington in London.
We do.
And you've got fairly high social presence over there. I mean,
we work a lot. We work a lot. But we've just written our first book together.
Oh, you have?
A children's book. That is coming out in October.
Well, let me show your better half at the moment. Her name's Santa.
She's a lot better looking than I am, I can tell you.
Here she is.
My name is Santa Montefiore. I live in London here. This is my garden in Kensington. And I live with my husband, Simon Sebag Montefiore, and my 2 children, Lily, who is 6, and Sasha, my son, who is 4. I always wanted to write. I always did write. As a child, I wrote little books for children and friends of my parents, and then when I got to school I started writing short stories for my girlfriends, and then a friend of my mother's once read one, and she was a writer, and said, "Oh darling, you really should try and get something published." So I followed the formula and I wrote one. By return of post it was sent back to me, rejection of course, and that was the start of a lot of rejections. And I think being a writer, you just have to swallow the rejections, put them in a bottom drawer and continue.
That's hilarious.
You two have been married for... You ever see that?
No, I've never seen that. But you'll notice when she's leaning there in our library, it's quite funny because she's talking about all her lovely books that she's written, and she's leaning on Stalin's complete works just behind her, if you look carefully.
How long have you been married?
Oh, God, a long time. We married in 1998.
How does it work with the two of you both writing books all the time?
Do you know, originally we actually worked at the same table. When we started writing, we didn't have any hope that we'd be successful, so we had a very small apartment, not in Kensington, and we had one table, which was our sort of dining room table and our desk, and we worked at different sides of it, and we spent our whole time arguing about what kind of music to listen to, because she wanted to listen to sort of Celine Dion all the time, which of course I could not tolerate. Well, I wanted to listen to sort of Guns N' Roses or David Bowie or Flo Rida or, you know, or Pitbull, or sort of loud driving music, which helped me keep up my narrative drive in these long books. So we argued a lot about music. We argued mainly about music, but now we have our own offices in our house at different ends of the house, so she can listen to all the Celine Dion she likes.
As you know, we haven't even begun to talk about this book. There's so much more in here, and there's one thing I wanted to bring up because it just stupefied me as I'm reading it. The dwarfs.
The dwarfs.
What's the whole... I mean, tell us, how often did these emperors, I don't know what you'd call it, play with the dwarfs?
Well, the dwarfs are kind of... I mean, a lot of reviewers have said that this book makes the Game of Thrones look like a vicar's tea party, I think one of them said in the Financial Times. You know, the dwarfs were kind of key. They partly signified the kind of exceptionalism, the sort of exceptional sanctity of the Tsar. They wanted people around them they had a lot of cripples around them, a lot of freaks, a lot of fools, and they had dwarfs. And the dwarfs were often like their favourite people. But Peter the Great loved to have dwarfs' weddings. He had giants' weddings. The Empress Anna was really a character out of Game of Thrones. She was a cruel, horrible, sultry, vindictive woman, and she had an entourage of women who were lacking limbs. So one was called the legless one was called the armless one. She also had fools. She made princes into fools, and they had to, when she came out of church, they had to sit on eggs dressed as chickens and cluck. Then she had another fool who she said should get married. And so the fool invited to his house, where he was in bed with a lactulating goat, who he said was his new wife. And she loved that. And worst of all, she loved dwarf tossing, and dwarfs to have fights where they pulled each other's hair. And if they refused to fight or refused to be tossed, they were beaten. But if they did what she said, she would spoil them with new clothes and food and big cash gifts, so that some of them became incredibly rich. By the end of the sort of 1740s, but it was an extraordinary story. I mean, this is an amazing sort of family story if you think about it, where dwarfs are tossed, terrible cruelties are perpetrated, the empire is increased, there are great love affairs, but it's also a family where fathers kill their sons, where wives have their husbands overthrown and murdered, where sons collude in the murder of fathers. This is a family unlike any other.
How many of the 20 Romanovs you write about were assassinated or killed?
Well, of the last 12, 6 were murdered violently, or were either assassinated or murdered. So that gives you an idea. So from the late 18th century onwards, half of them were killed. So I guess one of the themes of the book is Russia's a very hard country to rule, and to be Tsar is a very hard thing to be.
Should President Putin be called Tsar Putin?
He should be, because he's really the Tsar now. People say, you know, is he rich? Is he corrupt? You know, there have been a lot of these stories. But Russians, especially powerful Russians that I know, just laugh about this very question. They said, for him, wealth is irrelevant. He's the Tsar. Everything belongs to him.
Who tried the most to get a democracy over there?
Well, I think Alexander II is the most kind of sympathetic of the family.
How about modern day?
You
know, of Gorbachev's Yeltsin.
Yeltsin is a hugely underrated character. I mean, he was a flawed, great but flawed. I mean, he was a drunk. He went to war in Chechnya, and terrible things were done there. But he opened up Russia. He tried to correct abuses. He opened up history. He brought in democracy.
You say you brought in Putin. What did he think Putin would do?
Well, the trouble with Russia, and this is goes back to the succession thing we were talking about earlier, is that it's impossible for an autocrat, for a Tsar, to retire without being murdered. And in our own period, it's impossible for a president to retire without agreement that he, and his entire entourage and family, will not be prosecuted for either war crimes or for vast corruption. And that means that, in effect, it's virtually impossible for any president to retire. And that's why when Yeltsin did retire, he made a deal with his successor. And that's why Putin can never really retire. And he was asked, by the way, by his entourage, saying, will you ever give up? Will you ever retire? And he said, I'll never retire. I will never be like Gorbachev or Nicholas II and leave the country to chaos, to scum, to hooligans. He said, they were weak Tsars, they were betrayers, and I will never abdicate.
I want those that have joined us to know that in our C-SPAN archive they can find another 3 hours of you talking about Stalin and Jerusalem and other things. And this book, The Romanovs, new in the year 2016. What's next?
Oh, I'm going to write. I've written 2 novels set in Russia in the 20th century. They're love stories, and they're sort of thrillers and love stories. And I'm just writing the 3rd of the trilogy, and then I'll have done the trilogy, which will be lovely.
Next nonfiction book.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'm signed up to write a history of the world, which could be a step too far. So that's in the distant future.
What do you do when you're not writing and researching?
I spend time with my wife, who I love you showing me that video. I mean, it's a few years old, and it's so lovely to see her, but it's made my whole day. It's cheered me up enormously on this exhausting 9-city tour of America.
How old are your 2 kids now?
They're now 15 and 13.
Either one of them interested in writing?
Yeah, they're both quite good at writing, but I don't want to pressure them, because to make a living as a writer is a very hard thing, and not many people get to do it. So I don't want to sort of force them into doing any one thing or other, but it must be funny for them, because me and Santa are both writers. And as you can see, she's kind of a delightful person to live with.
Our guest has been Simon Sebag Montefiore. His family is even in this book, I think on page 372, which people can read, called The Romanovs, 1613 to 1918. And we thank you very much for joining us.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.